The wine glass left her hand before she knew she'd dropped it. I watched it tumble end over end, that thin stem turning once in the air, and then the burgundy hit the linen and bloomed outward like an inkblot test. My mother-in-law's mouth was still half open from the words she'd been saying. Her face had gone the color of skim milk. "Algun problema, suegra?" I asked. Quiet. Almost gentle. "Is something wrong?" The dining room went still in a way I'd never heard before. 9 people, and not one of them breathing. My father-in-law's steak knife stopped halfway through a cut of brisket and just hung there. My wife, Camila, was looking at me like I'd grown a second head, and the second head was holding a gun. But I'm getting ahead of it. Let me back up to that morning, because the day didn't start with a wine glass on the floor. The day started with me ironing a shirt. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm 41 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a firm in Houston that builds hospitals, and until that Saturday in March, I would have told you I had a perfectly normal life. 3 years married. A 2-bedroom house in the Heights, a son named Mateo, who was 19 months old and had just figured out how to say daddy juice in one word. A used Tacoma in the driveway with a cracked taillight I kept meaning to fix. My wife's family had invited us to her father's 65th birthday dinner at their house in River Oaks. Camila's parents, Hector and Lucia Restrepo, had come up from Medellín almost 30 years ago and built what Hector called a modest import business that imported coffee, flowers, and, I'd learn later, a few other things. Modest, in River Oaks, means a 6,000 square foot house with a circular drive and 2 black SUVs out front. They had always been polite to me. Lucia would kiss my cheek and call me Mijo, but you could feel the air change when I walked into a room. Hector would shake my hand a beat too firmly. I'd told myself for 3 years it was a culture thing, or a class thing, or a no man is good enough for my daughter thing. I'd told myself a lot of things. Here's what nobody knew, what I had never bothered to mention, not even to Camila on our first date or our wedding night, or any of the 1,000 quiet evenings since. I'd spent 6 years in Colombia, 2 in Bogota doing my master's in civil engineering on a Fulbright, and 4 more in Medellín working for a consortium retrofitting bridges and government buildings after the cartel years. I left in 2017. I came back to Houston, took a job, met Camila at a Whole Foods of all places. She was buying mangoes and asked me which ones were ripe, and I picked one up and squeezed it the way an old señora in Envigado had taught me, and Camila laughed and told me her name. I never told her I'd lived there. I don't know exactly why. Part of it was that those Medellín years weren't all good. I'd lost a friend in a hit and run that wasn't a hit and run, and I'd come home with the kind of quiet that takes a long time to leave a person. Part of it was that I'd signed a non-disclosure with the Department of State because some of the buildings we worked on were consulates and DEA field offices, and I don't talk about Colombia became a habit before I knew it was a habit. And part of it, if I'm honest, was that when Camila said her family was Colombian, something in me, some animal part, went very still and said don't. I don't know what that was. I'm still not sure. But I listened to it. For 3 years I listened. So that Saturday I ironed a white linen shirt, put on the watch Camila had given me for our first anniversary, and we drove over to River Oaks with Mateo in his car seat, gnawing on a teething cracker. The house had a valet for the night. There were maybe 20 cars in the drive. I should have known then that this wasn't going to be a quiet family dinner. Lucia opened the door and made a sound of delight at Mateo, scooped him up, and walked him into the house without quite acknowledging me. Hector clapped my shoulder and said, "Daniel, you look thin. Eat tonight? Eat." Camila smiled at me the way she'd been smiling for the last few weeks, which is to say, not quite at me. Off to the side a little. Like I was a piece of furniture she was making sure was still in place. The guests were Hector's brother Rodrigo and his wife Marta, both flown in from Cartagena that week. Camila's cousin Sebastian, who I'd met twice and never liked. He had the smile of a man selling you a car you can't afford. And then there was a man I hadn't met before. Tall, mid-30s, well-dressed in that careful way men dress when they want you to know the suit is Italian. He was introduced to me as Andres Vargas, an old family friend, a business associate from Cali. He shook my hand, said in heavily accented English, "Pleasure, my friend. And that was it. We sat down. Mateo was passed around the table like a plate of empanadas. There were toasts in English to Hector, to my father who taught me everything. And then, as the wine got going and the second bottle came out, the conversation slid into Spanish. I'd expected this. They always did this. For 3 years I had sat through dinners pretending to study the rim of my plate, while they laughed and gossiped in their own language. I would smile when others smiled. I would nod when others nodded. I had become very good at it. What I hadn't expected was what they would say once they thought I couldn't hear. It started small. Marta, the aunt from Cartagena, said in Spanish, "He looks tired, your gringo. Does he ever smile?" Camila laughed and said, also in Spanish, "He's an engineer, Tia. He smiles inside, where you can't see." Polite laughter. I cut into my brisket. I kept my face neutral. Then Hector, leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine, said in Spanish, "And how is the boy? Is he sleeping through the night yet?" "Mostly," Camila said. "André, he looks more like you every month, mi amor. Look at the eyes. I think I have gone over this moment 1,000 times in my head. I think my hand actually paused on its way to the water glass. Just a fraction of a second. I don't know if anyone saw it. I picked up the water and drank. Andrés, mi amor. The man across the table from me. The man I had just shaken hands with for the first time. Andrés smiled at my son in a way I had not seen any man other than me smile at my son, and said in Spanish, "He has my mother's chin. Pobrecito, with a chin like that." The whole table laughed. Lucia, my mother-in-law, the woman who had picked Mateo up at the door, said in Spanish, "Thank God he didn't get the gringo's face. Imagine, 3 years of pretending." Hector raised his glass, in Spanish, to the gringo, who pays the mortgage and the daycare and never asks where the second car came from. May he keep working long hours. They clinked glasses. They all clinked glasses. My wife clinked her glass with the man sitting across from me. I want to tell you that I felt something. Rage, heartbreak, the roof falling in. But I'll tell you the truth. What I felt was a kind of cold quiet, like the moment before a building shifts. I'm an engineer. I've stood under structures when they make sounds they shouldn't make. You learn to be very still. You learn to listen to what the building is telling you. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of brisket. I chewed it. I tasted nothing. And then they kept going. Sebastian, the cousin, asked in Spanish how the immigration paperwork was going. Hector said, "Almost done. Camila's residency is permanent now. They issued the card in January." Lucia said, 3 years. They make you wait 3 years. Then we're free of him. And the house? Sebastian asked. In her name? Hector said. From the beginning. Hector said. From the beginning. He thinks they bought it together, but the down payment came from us. And the boy stays with her? Marta asked. Camila said, and I want you to understand, I am quoting her exactly, in the language she used. El niño se queda con la familia verdadera. Andrés su padre, el otro es solo un papel. The boy stays with the real family. Andrés is his father. The other one is just a piece of paper. Andrés put his hand over Camila's on the table. Right there, in front of God and Hector and Lucia and Sebastian and the brisket and me. And then Lucia, who had held my son at the door, said, almost dreamily, in Spanish, Pobre Daniel. He thinks he is a husband. He is a green card with legs. Now, here is the thing nobody ever tells you about discovering your entire life is a lie at a dinner table in River Oaks. You don't get to scream. You don't get to flip the table. Your child is in a high chair 4 feet away, gnawing on a piece of bread, and your child does not understand any of this, and your child needs you not to scream. So you don't. I set my fork down. I picked up my wine glass, the one I had refilled twice. I looked across the table at my mother-in-law, the woman who had just called me a green card with legs in a language she believed I could not understand, and I felt something settle in me. Not rage, not even sadness, something older than both of those. I have spent 6 years of my life in Colombia. I learned Spanish in the slow way, the right way, from old men in cafes. From the woman who ran my building's porteria, from arguing with contractors in Bogota about rebar specifications. I do not speak the careful Spanish of a textbook. I speak the Spanish of a man who has lived there. So I leaned forward just a little, and I said to my mother-in-law, in the Spanish she had used, "Sueker." Algún problema. That's where the wineglass left her hand. That's where my father-in-law's knife stopped mid-air. That's where my wife, the mother of my child, looked at me like I had just walked into the room for the first time. For 3 or 4 seconds, nobody spoke. I could hear the ice maker in the kitchen drop a load of cubes. I could hear Mateo babbling to himself. Andres recovered first. He said, in Spanish, "¿Tú hablas español?" I switched to English because I wanted Camila to understand every single word, and I wanted her to understand it slowly. I lived in Colombia for 6 years, I said. 2 in Bogotá, 4 in Medellín. I worked retrofitting government buildings, including, for what it's worth, the U.S. consulate in Medellín. I speak the kind of Spanish a man speaks when he has argued with a foreman in Belén about whether the concrete will hold. So yes, Andres. Sí, hablo español. Camila's face had drained completely. She said, "Daniel, is he mine?" I asked. She didn't answer. "Camila, I am asking you in front of your family. Is Mateo my son?" Hector started to speak, in Spanish by reflex, and I said, "Calat." Hector started to speak, in Spanish by reflex, and I said, "Calat." Hector, "La pregunte a tu hija." "Shut up, Hector. I asked your daughter." He shut up. Camila looked at Andres. Andres looked at his plate. Camila looked at her mother. Lucia, to her credit or her shame, looked at the tablecloth. "He is biologically Andres," Camila said finally, in English, quiet, like the word biologically could carry the weight. I stood up. I walked around the table, slowly, because I did not want to scare my son, and I picked Mateo up out of the high chair. He had brisket on his cheek. I wiped it with my thumb. He said, "Dada." "Yes, baby," I said. "Daddy's here." I turned to the table. "I want you to understand something. I have never in my life felt as calm as I felt in that moment. It was the calm of a man who has just discovered that the foundation is gone, but the building is, for the moment, still standing. I said, I am leaving with my son. If anyone tries to stop me, I will call the police, and I will tell them in English and in Spanish exactly what was discussed at this table tonight. Hector, I would also strongly advise you not to make any phone calls in the next 24 hours that you wouldn't want a federal agent listening to. I worked next to those people for 4 years. I still know some of them." Hector's face did a complicated thing. "You can't take him," Camila said. "He's my son. He's on a birth certificate that says I'm his father," I said, "which makes him my son too, in the only way the state of Texas cares about. Talk to a lawyer. I'll be talking to mine." I walked out with Mateo on my hip. I picked up the diaper bag by the front door. The valet looked at me, looked at my face, and silently handed me my keys without making me wait. I drove. I didn't go home. I couldn't go home. The house was hers, technically, and I needed to think. I drove to a Buc-ee's off I-10, because Buc-ee's is open 24 hours and has good coffee and a clean bathroom for a 19-month-old. And I sat in the parking lot under those bright lights and I started making phone calls. The first call was to my older brother Caleb in San Antonio. He's a Bexar County prosecutor. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Daniel, listen to me. Tonight you sleep at a hotel. Use a credit card in your name only. Tomorrow you call Karen Yoshida. I'll text you her number. She handles family law. She's a barracuda. Do not go back to that house tonight." I asked him why. He said, "Because if your wife's family is what you think they might be, the first thing they'll do is call a lawyer of their own and try to file an emergency custody motion before you do. You file first. You file Monday morning. And tonight you keep that boy with you and you do not answer your phone unless it's me." I checked into a Hampton Inn off the Beltway. I paid cash for the deposit and used a card for the room. I bought formula and diapers from the gas station next door. Mateo fell asleep on my chest watching ESPN with the sound off. I didn't sleep. I sat up against the headboard and I wrote down every single sentence I could remember from that dinner, in Spanish and in English, in a yellow legal pad I'd grabbed from my truck. I wrote until 4 a.m. I dated and signed every page. Monday morning, I sat in Karen Yoshida's office in the Galleria. She was 5'2" and wore a charcoal suit and looked at me over a pair of reading glasses for about 10 seconds before she said, "Mr. Whitaker, I'm going to need you to tell me everything from the beginning, and I do mean everything. Don't edit. Don't be embarrassed. I've heard worse. I promise you I've heard worse," I told her. She took notes. When I got to the part about Hector's import business, she stopped writing and said, "What kind of imports?" "Coffee, flowers, allegedly." She wrote one word on her pad, underlined it, and moved on. When I finished, she put down her pen and said, "Okay, here's what we know. You're on the birth certificate. Texas calls that the presumed father. That presumption is rebuttable, but rebutting it is a process and it takes time. We file for divorce on grounds of fraud. Texas allows that. We file for emergency temporary custody, and we file a motion that explicitly raises concerns about international flight risk. Your wife's family has assets and connections in Colombia. Any judge in Harris County is going to take that seriously." I asked, "What are my chances?" She didn't sugarcoat. She said, "Of full custody? In a normal case, 50-50. In your case, with documented fraud, with the citizenship timeline, with a credible flight risk argument, I'd say 70-30 in your favor, and I'd say it's 90-10 that we get temporary primary while we sort the rest out. But I want to be honest with you. The biological father can file to establish paternity. If he does, we have a real fight. If he doesn't, and I have a hunch he won't, because filing means putting his name on paperwork the Department of Homeland Security can read, then we are in a much stronger position." We filed Monday afternoon. By Tuesday morning, Camila had been served at her parents' house. By Wednesday, her lawyer had filed back, full custody to her, supervised visits for me, allegations that I was unstable, and had removed the child against the mother's wishes from a family event. Karen called me. "They're predictable. Don't worry. The judge will see through it. You'll see." The temporary custody hearing was the following Wednesday in family court at the civil courthouse downtown. I wore the same charcoal suit I'd worn to my mother's funeral. Camila came in with Lucia and Hector and an attorney whose hourly rate I could have estimated by the cufflinks. I sat next to Karen. I did not look at my wife. Their lawyer went first. He painted me as a controlling husband who had publicly humiliated his wife in front of her family, who had abducted the child, who was making wild and racially tinged allegations about a respected Houston family. Karen got up. She was very calm. She said, "Your Honor, we have a few things to put on the record. First, the timeline." She handed up a folder. My client married Camila Restrepo in March of 2022. Ms. Restrepo was at that time on an expiring student visa. They had a son in August of 2023. Ms. Restrepo was at that time on an expiring student visa. They had a son in August of 2023. Restrepo received her green card in January of this year as part of the standard 3-year conditional to permanent pathway for spouses of U.S. citizens. The petition for divorce was filed by my client 38 days after that adjustment cleared. The judge made a small note. "Second," Karen said, "we have testimony, which Mr. Whitaker is willing to give under oath, about a dinner conversation on March 16th at the home of Hector and Lucia Restrepo, in which multiple family members discussed in Spanish that the child is not biologically Mr. Whitaker's, that the marriage was contracted for immigration purposes, and that the family's plan was to obtain my client's residency, divorce him, and retain custody of the child. My client speaks fluent Spanish. He lived in Colombia for 6 years. The opposing party was unaware of this. Their lawyer objected. He said it was hearsay. Karen said it was a party admission, which is an exception, and besides, she wasn't asking the court to rule on it today. She was raising it as context for the temporary custody motion, which is reviewed under a different and more flexible standard. The judge asked Camila directly, "Ms. Martek, Restrepo, is there any truth to these allegations?" Camila looked at her lawyer. Her lawyer whispered something. Camila said, on advice of counsel, that she would not be answering questions today. The judge wrote something down. He did not look pleased. Then Karen brought up the flight risk. She introduced photos of Hector's business, records of his and Lucia's frequent travel to Colombia, 11 trips in the previous 18 months. She introduced a document showing that Mateo had a Colombian passport that I had never been told existed. That one I hadn't known. I sat very still. The judge looked up over his glasses and said, The child has a Colombian passport, Karen said. Issued through the Colombian consulate in Houston in October of last year. We obtained the record this week. The judge asked Camila's lawyer if he had been aware. The lawyer said he had not. The judge ruled from the bench. Temporary primary custody to me. Supervised visitation for the mother. Twice a week, 2 hours, at a court-approved facility. The child's U.S. and Colombian passports to be surrendered to the court that afternoon. A flag placed with CBP. No international travel pending the final hearing. The final hearing set for 90 days out after the paternity test came back. Camila made a small sound. Lucia said something in Spanish I did not catch. Hector looked at me across the courtroom in a way that made me very glad we were in a building with metal detectors. I walked out of that courtroom and I sat on a bench in the lobby and my hand started shaking for the first time since the dinner. Karen put a hand on my shoulder and said, Mr. Whitaker, you did good. You did real good. Now go home and be a dad. The next 90 days were the longest of my life. The paternity test came back the way we knew it would. Andres was the biological father. He did not, as Karen had predicted, file to establish paternity. I learned later from a friend at the U.S. Attorney's Office that there was an open inquiry into Hector's import business by the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Department of Homeland Security, and that Andres had a name that came up in that inquiry. Andres very much did not want to be on a Texas family court docket where his name and address would become a matter of public record. He flew back to Cali 3 weeks after the dinner. As far as I know, he hasn't been back to the United States. The final hearing came in June. Karen presented everything. The judge, same one, granted me sole legal and primary physical custody. Camila was given visitation, supervised for the first 6 months, then unsupervised but with no overnight stays and no travel outside Harris County. She is required to provide 48 hours notice for every visit. She is on the hook for child support based on what she earns at her parents' company, which is, conveniently, very little on paper. The divorce was granted on grounds of fraud. Judge specifically noted in the written order that the marriage had been entered into by Camila with the intent to obtain immigration benefits. That language matters. That language is now in a federal database somewhere. In August, U.S. Now in a federal database somewhere. Citizenship and Immigration Services issued a notice to appear to Camila for removal proceedings. They opened a fraud review. I don't know how that's going to end. I don't ask. Karen says it could take 2 years. She says the green card is, in her words, very probably toast. I will let you decide how I feel about that. Hector's import company was raided in October. I don't know what they found. The news said ongoing investigation. The 2 black SUVs disappeared from the River Oaks driveway. The house went on the market in February. Lucia called me once, in March, the anniversary of the dinner, and said in Spanish, Mijo, por favor. I hung up. Mateo is 2.5 now. He starts a Montessori program in the fall. He calls me daddy. Twice a week he sees his mother at a supervised visitation center off the West Loop. He comes home from those visits quiet. Then he sees the dog, and he forgets, the way 2-year-olds forget. He is a happy kid. He likes trucks. He likes the song, Wheels on the Bus. He puts Cheerios up his nose. I sold the house in the Heights. Couldn't sleep there. Bought a smaller place in Bel Air, closer to my brother in San Antonio in case I ever need him fast. I have a key under a rock that only Caleb knows about. I have a bag packed in the closet with 2 passports, mine and Mateo's, in a fireproof safe. I am not paranoid. I am a man who has learned what I am living next to. I have started seeing someone, slowly. Her name is Rachel. She's a pediatric nurse. She knows the whole story. I told her on the 3rd date, because I will not build another life on a thing I haven't said out loud. She listened. She cried a little. She said, Daniel, that's not a red flag for you. That's a red flag for her. Then she paid the check, which is a thing I will remember about her until I am an old man. Here's what I want to say to anyone who's reading this and recognizes any of it. Anyone who's felt the air change in a room. Anyone who's been told, in words or in silences, that they're a green card with legs, or a paycheck with legs, or a fool with legs. Trust the animal in you. The thing in me that said, don't tell her you lived there. I don't know what it knew. I don't know how it knew. But it knew. We are descended from people who survived because they listened to that thing. Listen to it, document everything. The minute you suspect, start writing it down. Dates, conversations, bank statements, photographs. Get it off your phone and into a file your spouse cannot access. I had a yellow legal pad and a Hampton Inn at 4 a.m., and that legal pad, Karen later told me, was the single most useful piece of evidence in my case, even though we never formally entered it. It made me a credible witness. It made my story specific. Specific stories win in court. Vague stories lose. Call your family. Call them before you call a lawyer. I called my brother before I called Karen. And I will tell you that the sound of my brother's voice that night in that parking lot is the only reason I am the man writing this, and not a man drinking himself to death in an apartment somewhere. Understand that biology is not the only thing, and in some courts and some lives, it is not even the main thing. I am Mateo's father. I was there for the first cry, the first bath, the first fever, the 3 a.m. that turned into 4 a.m., that turned into the pediatric ER. I am on the line at his daycare for emergency contact. I know which stuffed bear he sleeps with. I know that he doesn't like blueberries unless they're cut in half, which makes no logical sense but is true. That is fatherhood. The DNA is a footnote. The Texas Family Code, thank God, agrees with me. And, last thing, know that some people will look at you and not see a person. They will see a useful object, a green card, a mortgage, a father's name on a birth certificate. It is not your fault for not seeing them coming. It is the fault of the people who saw you that way. You can be an honest, trusting, decent man and still get bitten. The lesson is not to stop being honest and trusting and decent. The lesson is to keep your eyes open while you are. Mateo just wandered into the kitchen in his dinosaur pajamas. He's holding a half-eaten cracker and pointing at the refrigerator and saying, "Dada, juice, peas." He says please now. He's working on it. I gotta go. Some things don't need translating in any language. Some things, the most important things, are just a hand on a refrigerator door and a small voice saying peace, and the man who was lucky enough to hear it. I think about that dinner more often than I'd like to admit. Not the wine glass, not the silence, not even the look on Camila's face when she realized what I just said in her mother's own Spanish. What I think about is the 3 years before it. 3 years of small moments where something inside me leaned forward and said, "Pay attention," and 3 years of me telling that voice to sit down and be polite. I want to be honest with you about something. I am not a smart man because I survived that night. I survived that night because I had spent 6 years in a country that taught me to listen, and because some animal part of me had been listening for 3 years inside my own marriage and refused to let me speak. That isn't intelligence. That's a kind of inherited carefulness. The smart thing, the truly intelligent thing, would have been to honor that voice earlier, to ask the questions out loud, to say to my wife on date 3 or date 30, "I lived in your country. Here is what I saw there. Here is what I learned." I did not do that. I let a useful silence become a habit, and then a habit became a wall. And a wall is a thing other people can build a whole life behind without you noticing. There is a kind of cause and effect that operates in marriages that I did not understand when I was younger. Camila did not become a person who could call me a green card with legs in front of her family on the night of that dinner. She became that person slowly, in rooms I was not invited into, in a language she chose because she believed I could not follow her there. Every time she got away with something small, the next thing got a little bigger. Every time her family treated me like furniture, and I smiled politely, they learned that the price of treating me like furniture was nothing. I taught them that. By being agreeable. By being the easy son-in-law who didn't ask. People will treat you the way you let them treat you. And the bill comes due eventually, and it comes due all at once, and usually at a dinner table. What I want my son Mateo to learn, when he is old enough to learn it, is this. Be kind, but do not be useful to the wrong people. Be patient, but do not confuse patience with permission. And when the small voice in you says, "Don't," listen to it the first time, not the 40th. The first time is cheap. The 40th time costs you a house, a marriage, and 3 years you can't get back. I am still here. I have my son. I have a small life I built on the other side of a wine glass falling. That is a kind of nerve I did not know I had until I needed it. I hope if you ever need it, you find you have it too. We have more of it than we think. We just don't know until the night somebody hands us the bill.